All right, welcome to a very, very special Pro Football Doc Sports Injury Central podcast. Been looking forward to this for some time. Sorry about the backdrop, different. Surgery day, and this is what worked out for our special guest, very special guest. And Warren, can I say longtime friend, Warren Sharp, over the years here. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I don't know, probably 7, 8 years ago. I'm terrible with timing, but it was you, myself, and Evan. We brought you onto our podcast back in the early days and got some of your injury breakdowns for the upcoming weekend. That was like a Friday night, late night podcast, I think, on the East Coast. And we were sometimes grabbing you around your dinner time out there on the West Coast with your family. So those were some fun days when things weren't quite as serious. Things are a lot more serious now. It's a lot more investment into the game, but we've all come and grown our brands in the meantime, and certainly glad to circle back with you here before the start of the season. Really looking forward to it.
No, it was great. I look back at those times. I mean, that was kind of I was just doing injuries. I was very appreciative of you and Evan inviting me in. You guys would have like mega podcasts for hours and bring me in for a few minutes. And then I would beg to stay on for longer to listen to you guys and then try and make the injury information subject matter related to a particular game as opposed to in a silo. Here's injuries by itself. And obviously that's how you need to look at it. So I appreciate you guys educating me in that. And that was super fun back in the day. And I even look back then, I was literally on my couch. Now, unless it's a single game, we're in the war room and look, your business has grown. Back then, I remember, Warren, when you actually had a day job. Now this is your day job, right? I mean, and I remember hanging out with you at that Super Bowl, the Radio Row and some of the stuff. It might have been Atlanta. I don't know exactly which city it was. Might have been Atlanta, and thanks again for your friendship all these years, and thanks for the book that you just sent. Going through it, really appreciate it. Definitely a must-read Bible. And the only thing that I think that we can add to the book, and I'll just throw it in there, like I've been saying this on Twitter, the mini compliment, because your book has everything, right? And you can click on my links or your links to go get it there. And you spent a lot of time on it. And you spent a lot of time over the spring and summer on it, right? But there's no way you can predict the injuries that are already happened and the injuries of the progress of players coming off from last season. So with our producer here, Taylor, and the staff at Sports Injury Central, we've produced an 80-page preseason injury preview that goes through. I mean, it's not quite a Warren Sharp book, right? I mean, your stuff is completely different, but that's a good augment to your book. And we can talk about, I want to get into your book, but we might try and get our guys to offer that to some of your people. Right now at Sports Injury Central, it's free before the bosses decide to charge for it. So we'll figure that out. I used to write a little segment for you, but the problem with that is, you write it so early for the book that it sometimes becomes stale, right?
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of, the information becoming stale, that's not really. I think the book, one of the great things about the book, and you've got the hard copy because I sent it to you. Mm-hmm. This is being sold up at Amazon, but we are doing an offer on the website now where you can get the PDF for only $5 through your show if you just use the code DOC. So if you go to sharp.football, you can find a link and you can enter the code DOC, and this will drop from $35 down to $5 because there's not that much time before the season starts. You've got about a week and a half, 2 weeks really to dig into this, a little bit less than that before kickoff next Thursday. So there's a lot of crunch time. But one of the things that I think is helpful about the book is it gives you insight into rest edges as well as what the lines were this summer versus what they adapt to during the season, in part because of injuries. And so what you could see as well, Team A was favored by 3 points. Now the line is up to 6 points during the season. Now there's injuries to take into consideration, but is that line move from 3 to 6 justified? And then you can take your position, whether it is or it is not, and potentially place a bet as a result. But at least you'll know what those lines were before some of those injuries happened. But your booklet, whatever you guys are calling it there, certainly the more information you can get your hands on to study prior to the season starting, the better. This is an information game. It's about obtaining information and then trying to understand how much that information matters and then incorporate it into your process. So certainly love the fact that there's a lot of great information out there, and interested in checking that out.
Thank you. And we call it a preseason injury preview or guide, right? It's not a book. It's not like your book, which is massive. And I really appreciate it. I've gotten through a lot of it here, and I didn't mean at all to imply that your book in any way was stale. I was just saying, back in the day when I helped write a page or two or some of injury information, sometimes that was stale because I would submit it in the spring, right, for your book, and that would get stale. Whereas that's all. Not the book and all your great information. So my first question for you, Warren, is I know how much time you spend on the book. Like, you're not reachable in the off season. It's your busy season, right? I can't text you or DM you, etc. The NFL, you famously spend a lot of time looking at schedules and schedule inequities. Here's my question to you. The NFL clearly spends a lot of time, they've been documentaries on it, making the schedule and the different permutations and combinations. They spend a ton of time making the schedule. You spend a ton of time writing your book and analyzing the schedule. Who spends more time on the schedule, the NFL or Warren Sharp?
That's a great question. It's easily, though, the NFL, simply because it's kind of like the lines makers. They have to sit down and they have to come up with all of their lines for the season. And then I can come in and pick apart certain games to attack or focus in on. As it relates to, them making the schedule, it definitely is a challenge, because for them, it's pretty clear that their number one priority here is to try to get games that are going to bring in viewers from a TV perspective. They have adapted their strategy. Mike North has gone on podcasts and talked about it a lot. That is one of their biggest priorities, is get games that people want to watch on TV, figure out how to make those matchups happen. They don't schedule who's going to be playing, but they figure out when they're going to be able to schedule these games, and what games are going to put on primetime and what games they're going to put early in the season versus late in the season. And so they're spending a lot of time on that front. I just can come in with my database and I run the whole schedule through it, and I can look for inequalities pretty quickly. Now, it does take about a day and a half or so for me to really run through everything, because I've got it down to a science now. I've got it mastered, and then I can come back with some of my findings and jump in there with, this team's getting screwed, that team's getting screwed, this team's got a little bit easier path thanks to how they scheduled the games. But the one thing that I think people need to really realize and focus in on as it relates to the NFL schedule is that this is not the baseball season with Major League Baseball. This is not the basketball season. We're not talking about 160 plus games. We're not talking about 80 plus games. We're talking about 17 games. And we already know, based upon the strength of schedule in terms of who you're playing, those schedules are all over the map. Like some teams have easier schedules, even in the same division, based upon your record last year, who you're going to face this upcoming season. It varies tremendously, and it does give pre-flop, as in before the opening kickoff of the season, certain teams an edge over one another, even though the goal is for every single season, blank slate, new year, everybody's got the same opportunity to win this game. Let's kick the ball off with that opening Thursday night, and everybody's got an equal shot. That is not true based on the strength of schedule of the opponents that you're going to play. Now, the league can't control that. But what the league can control is when you're going to play these games. And their priority is simply on getting good games on TV. And as a result, there's been opportunities to poke holes in that, because they're making certain things more unfair to teams. And the way that I view it is, just in a nutshell to wrap it up, is that there is no perfect solution here. Certain teams are going to get the short end of the stick at times. The goal, though, to me, is try to make it as equitable as possible around all 32 teams in a single season, but then also try to balance whatever imbalances occurred in the prior year and rectify those pretty quickly in short order. This year we've got the San Francisco 49ers. They got screwed on rest last year. They're getting screwed on rest again this year. The worst team in the NFL in the number of games that they're playing at a rest disadvantage versus those that they play at an advantage. And that's happened now for a couple of consecutive seasons. And to me, this is something that needs to be rectified moving forward. And it's not that the 49ers can't win the Super Bowl because of this schedule. But the issue is they're one of the best teams in the NFL with one of the best rosters in the NFL. I know like there's attrition with injuries and whatnot that could compound one another and make it difficult later on in the season for them. But they do have a very solid overall roster. But as it relates to most other teams that aren't coached by Kyle Shanahan, that don't have as good of a roster, I mean, coaches are fighting for their jobs every year. And you give a team bad rest situations for a year or two in a row, all of a sudden that coach and his staff has lost a job. And so the goal should be to try to make this as equitable as possible while still putting good games on TV. I'm not saying that, but I just have a different priority as it relates to balance before the opening kickoff.
Well, you make some really good points. Strength of schedule. The interesting thing that everyone, as you know, forgets about is, the schedule. The games are all set. It's just when are they played, right? And it's very symmetrical. So strength of schedule, other than playing within a weak division, which everyone gets the advantage in the division in theory, is the 3 games, right? The 3 games where you're matched against your same place finisher. But I do see the access shift, and your book points it out that there have been no teams with 3 games in 10 days across the last 5 years. And this year there's 10 of them. And the 49ers have done that. And it makes sense that the 49ers would get picked on. They're a marquee team. And they're probably, the NFL, if you look at a map of the NFL, is a very Northeast-centric league. And having worked with the San Diego Chargers, we knew that we would always be on the lower end or the worst end of the travel disadvantages, right? Just because of time zones and far away and whatever. And if you really look at the West Coast, which is the team that's been solidly a winner and a TV draw over the last couple of years? It's been the 49ers, right? So it's a TV-made league, and I think that's why you're right. There's no real access change in scheduling. You're sure there are 2 Wednesday games this year because of Christmas, but those 4 teams that play on Christmas play the Saturday before Christmas, so it's no different than a Sunday to Thursday, so to speak. But you're right. I think it's for TV that it's all these good teams that are getting these games. But let me ask this question, Warren. I think you're making a big deal about the lack of rest is appropriate, right? It's the collision sport of football. But then do you make some accommodation for the other side? The sword cuts both ways when they actually get more rest. And does it kind of equal out that way, or in your view, does it not?
No, I think it does. I mean, that's why certain teams are benefited by this schedule as they make it, and other teams are more impacted by the schedule. To me, and I don't know, your opinion or your expertise based on detailed tracking of the injuries, but rest seems to matter more later on in the season, and having that extra rest or being screwed and having less rest is a compounding factor later in the season. I think if you look at a team like the Kansas City Chiefs last year, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do know that they played 6 consecutive games late in the season last year, from maybe week 12 to week 16, 17, where they were at a rest disadvantage in every single game. And we know how this team started the season and then limped down the stretch later on in the season as a result, in part because of some of those rest issues. And I think from a scheduling and an ATS perspective, that's the easiest way to look at it, because I don't think the markets have fully incorporated rest into them. This team was, I want to say, like 12-2 or 12-3 when they had relatively equal rest to their opponent. But when they had 2 or more days of less rest than their opponent, they were like 1-5 ATS. Now they won some of those games. I think they went 4-2 or something like that, or 3-3 in those games. But it still clearly was impacting their ability to perform to expectations, which is what the point spread is suggesting. And so I do think, there's teams that then benefit by playing an opponent who's off of multiple games of rest disadvantage. That one team who has a little bit more rest late in the season will have an advantage. So I do believe it absolutely cuts both ways.
I appreciate that. And, from my experience in the league, everyone talks about, the Thursday games, the quality of football, the lack of rest, the injury danger. I agree with the NFL. The injury danger hasn't panned out on short rest. But what people forget is a lot of players, they don't talk about this. Sometimes they secretly like the Thursday game. Why is that? You really don't practice leading up to the Thursday game. It's just walkthroughs. And guess what? You get the mini bye afterwards, right? Some time off. So in that 2-week stretch, you actually net have fewer practices and more days off, even though it's a Sunday to Thursday turnaround. So it does cut both ways, as you suggest. And the other thing, maybe you've looked at this, and I'm just thinking about this now as we talk about this with you. I think the biggest disadvantage for this schedule anomaly that you're talking about, and I don't know how many teams qualify for this, maybe Taylor can look it up on the fly in the background as we're talking here, is the recipe for the worst situation, as you talk about late season and, buildup of fatigue, is an early season bye followed by a late season 3 games in 10-day stretch. That's probably the worst combination, because you want that by midway or 2/3 of the way through. If teams have a choice, that would be the place to put that by. I don't know if you've looked at that at all, or that's something that you think would be an additional factor to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to study it this year, right? The NFL basically banned this 3 games in 10 days bit, years ago, and we didn't see any of them. And it used to be something that I would chart. I would chart 4 games of 17, 3 games of 10. And all of a sudden, over the past prior few seasons, it's like, okay, there's none of these. Okay, there's none of these. Hey, that's great. Like, that's an improvement. I'm not putting a tick mark on my, column in Excel to say this team has 3 games in 10 days. Now, all of a sudden, no teams are in that column is filled out for. But that's a good thing, because I believe that that's going to be more beneficial to player health and the quality of our games. You mentioned, that Thursday game. And also, like, teams coming off of a bye week, we have found teams coming off of a bye week haven't had as much of an advantage since the CBA. And in part, it's because the restriction on practice time. And so potentially why we're seeing some poor football, especially by the teams that are the underdog in these Thursday games, is because there isn't as much practice time leading into them. There's not as much time to game plan, is to strategize and to get your guys walking through everything that you want them to do for Thursday games. So the better teams have more of an advantage on Thursday. But I do believe that there's something to the lack of practice time and how teams then return from that. So there is a rest versus rust element to this, but I don't know what the impact is going to be on the 3 games in 10 days, because it's happened so infrequently of late. But what I can tell you is I do some deeper analysis in the book, in the chapter up front about this rest issue. And what I did find is that the teams that were playing 3 games in 10 days historically, again, not in the last 5 years because we haven't seen it, but those teams did struggle, especially in that final game of that stretch. And so in the book, I list all 10 teams, like you said, there's 10 of them that have to deal with this 3 games in 10 days. And we list when that 3rd game is and when that 2nd game is, identify it in each of the team chapters. The Jets are an interesting one because they're one of the teams that plays the 3 games in 10 days right at the beginning of the season. So they're one of the more intriguing teams. I want to say it's weeks 2, 3, 4 that they're playing their 3 games in 10 days. But other than that, most of these teams, it's midway to late in the season, especially around Christmas time. But the one thing about the teams that are playing on Christmas that's at least a little bit more bearable is that in those situations, those teams, they've basically set aside like 4 teams and did something like a mini bubble where it's like 2 are going to play each other and then they're going to swap and they're going to play the opponent. And so that's how they're getting their final 2 games in of these 3-10. And it makes it a little bit more even and balanced because this team has the exact same rest as me. We're both played on Sunday. Now we're playing Wednesday. It's the same exact rest, or Saturday to Wednesday. We're both dealing with the same exact thing. So that's a little bit more bearable. But then what the league, I think, did is they said, well, if we're doing this for these few teams and it's okay to do this now, then let's do it for 6 other teams, at different points in the schedule. But in those situations, their opponents have more rest than they do on the second game and the third game of those 3-10.
Well, yeah, these Wednesday and other games are coming because, I think strongly when the NFL goes to 18 games and it's coming, that's when they're going to add 2 buys. And when you have 2 buys and take away another preseason game, 2 preseason games, one home preseason game just as a run through for every team, that's it. Then 18 games, 2 buys. And then if you pair teams coming off of buys, you can play almost any day of the week, right? But that's a whole nother discussion for when that comes. All right, so since we do injuries and other things, let me ask you this question. You talk about rest, and that's a big deal. Bigger factor this year, this NFL change in rest for these 10 teams, et cetera, for TV rating, that or the effect of the hip drop tackle. You talk a lot about hip drop tackle. You talk about 230 times last year in 2023 that this would have, quote, been a penalty. Tell us about what you think the effect will be on the game.
It's amazing. I haven't heard anybody talk about hip drop tackle since you just said it right there, all preseason, because they aren't calling it. I don't recall that there's been a single hip drop tackle called in the preseason, which is amazing to me because last year all we heard about was if this gets changed in terms of rules, it's going to ruin the sport. The sport is done for if we allow people, if we don't allow people to tackle using this hip drop method. And I thought that was the most ludicrous comment out there. I thought that I do not like seeing guys get hurt, especially players that are impactful for their teams, but it doesn't really matter. I don't like seeing guys get injured in ways that could be avoidable. And to me, the hip drop tackle is no different than the old horse collar tackle. It's a technique that was being taught. Those tackles did not exist in this frequency a decade ago, but we saw the proliferation of it come about in the last, several years. And I did a bunch of research. I studied how they got rid of it in, I don't call it like Australian rules football or some league like that, that they put rules in and fine players and were able to kind of try to eliminate it from the game. And, one off, you never know how somebody's going to do it. Like you're never going to 100% prevent anybody from ever doing it, but you're going to legislate it out of the game. And so I hope that we're on the downtrend of that peak where we had a fair number of them last year, and now we're going to have much less of them moving forward. So I don't know if we're going to get them called in the games or they're just going to issue fines. And then the players are going to have to learn, hey, I can't do this, but they're not going to actually be 15-yard penalties. It remains to be seen. The 2024 preseason was theoretically like a testing ground, a proving ground to see how much they're going to call it, see how much it might impact the game. They haven't called it at all. So I don't know if it's because players haven't been tackling like that or if it's because they just aren't trying to call it nearly as much. I haven't watched every second of every preseason game like I would during the regular season. So I'm not quite sure the impact of it, to be honest, Doc. I think that it's going to have an impact in terms of giving 15 yards and a first down to teams. If that is to happen a couple times a game, that's going to have an impact on how that football moves down the field and potentially a little impact on scoring. But at this point, we just don't really know how close it's going to be called. So it's hard to go into week one and bet week one any differently than we've been, handicapping it in the past because this rule is in place because we just don't know how frequently it's going to be implemented. Yes,
I'm going to change angle here just because I don't want him to see a patient walk in the room there. We're in the surgery center, so sorry about that there. But I agree with you, Warren. First of all, for years at Sports Injury Central, we've lobbied to outlaw the hip drop tackle. We said it's as dangerous as the horse collar. Now, it is interesting that obviously horse collar is a dangerous play, so is hip drop tackle. But I do find it interesting that the NFL does not outlaw pulling you down by the hair on the back of your neck, which is as dangerous, but I guess it's their subtle way of saying cut your hair or put it inside the helmet kind of deal. But they don't outlaw that. But the hip drop tackle is absolutely a bad injury scenario. So I'm glad the rule is there. And yeah, people say, well, how are you going to tackle? But here's my thought. I think that I'm with you. Forget the fact that in preseason it wasn't called, but maybe it's an effort thing. But there are, four stringers trying to make teams. But you know what? Also, it's a bad look when you leave your feet. So maybe that's why it's not called in the preseason, because that's a component. You're taught to drive through the tackle with your feet. And if you're hanging on for dear life against a bigger player and swinging your hips, not only is that a potential penalty, but in the preseason, that is a sign that you're not fit for the NFL, that you can't get the job done and make a tackle. And maybe that's why it hasn't been called or we haven't seen it, because you can't be tired and hanging on for dear life. In the regular season, you're doing what you can to get a guy down. But in the preseason, you do that. That does not show well on film. You're supposed to drive through a tackle and use your legs kind of thing. If you get run over by a bigger player, so be it, but you have to take the hit. So maybe that's why it hasn't been called. But I agree with you. Even though first of all, I think teams are going to do it less often, right? Because they don't want the penalty. So that's going to cut that in half. And then the rules are written very specifically, as you know, 2 arms and then unweight and then swing and land. So I look at it as if you 2 hands and you partially unweight and swing and land, but have your right foot dragging on the ground, it may not get called, right? And so there's ways to still do the hip drop without it being a classic hip drop and get called. So I look at it as roughing the passer will still be the most impactful injury-related penalty, followed by body weight penalty. A distant third is going to be hip drop. I would expect less than half a game, and be called. Mm-hmm. So I'm with you on that, just because of the things that we talked about here. Anyways, and by the way, I appreciate you. I forgot to mention this. I don't know that I've ever had a promo code after me, Doc. So go get the Warren Sharp book and put in the Doc, and the electronic version is great. I don't want to take up too much of your time here. I know you're super busy, and I'd love to make this a regular occurrence and so forth, just like the old days. Whatever you want to do, Warren. We should put the band back together. Let's get you, me, and Evan on a podcast together and put it across everyone's channel. I think Evan's gone on to great success. You've gone on to great success. I'm just plodding along, trying to raise a family and watch football on Sundays from the war room. But give us, for people who haven't looked at your book, give us your biggest open-ended question, your biggest surprise, up and down situation, team, or otherwise, that you would get out of reading your book.
Man, look, I'm a little bit bigger on the Seattle Seahawks this upcoming season than I think the market is right now. I think that a lot of people are looking at the Seahawks as a team that just is this team off to the side. They're not really in contention. The Rams really came on a little bit last season. You obviously have the San Francisco 49ers, who are a strong team, but I'm interested to see Mike McDonald. You know me, Doc, I'm a big proponent of coaching and how much coaching matters. And I'm really intrigued. I think that some things with Pete Carroll, like just having a guy there who's been there for so long, it just gets a little bit stale. And I think it's going to be quite refreshing bringing in a new face with a new voice, with new tactics and strategies and ways to run things. It's going to reinvigorate, I think, the culture there in Seattle. I think the tactics and methods of defense that he brings to the table are going to be interesting. This is not a team that has enough talent, in my opinion, but I also am really intrigued by, what Ryan Grubb might be bringing to this offense. And Geno Smith has overexceeded expectations, I think, for a lot of us with his starts and tenure there in Seattle. They certainly have a great receiving core. Their top 3 receivers are outstanding from a talent perspective, but it's ironic that when they had those 3 players on the field together in terms of Metcalf and Lockett and
Smith and JSN,
who was really shockingly underwhelming last year. When all 3 of those guys were on the field together, they had worse efficiency passing out of those 3 wide receiver sets than they did when one of those guys was off the field. And to me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm really intrigued by how Grubb might be orchestrating this offense a little bit differently to get that offense to where it should be based on a talent perspective. And of course, they've got some backs there that are capable of moving the ball on the ground. So that's a team that's exciting and interesting to me. Another team that I just think, like 2 teams that were good last year that I just fail to believe will be any worse this year and have even higher ceilings, although it's impossible to say that for the second team I'll mention. But if you talk about like the Detroit Lions made it to the NFC Championship game, should have won that game, in my opinion. Obviously had a massive lead at halftime. But this defense was absolutely horrific when they tried to blitz. They were the worst defense in the NFL when they blitzed. And for whatever reason, their defensive coordinator, he likes to send pressure. They were blitzing at a very high rate, and they were terrible as a result, playing pass defense. They're solid against the run, terrible against the pass. This is how so many teams were competing with them, how they could never really pull away in massive blowout fashion frequently, is because their pass defense was so bad. And when you are winning a game, then opponents are going to pass on you, and then they're having success passing on you. So you got these shootouts against the Detroit Lions, and they're not winning by large enough margins. This pass defense actually last season was top 10 whenever they just didn't blitz. If they did not blitz, they were a top 10 pass defense. They were putting too much stress on the outside corners last year by sending pressure and forcing these guys to play man coverage on an island. And I think this year, they've increased their talent pool at the cornerback position. They've brought in guys in free agency. They've added guys in the draft. Their top 2 draft picks were cornerbacks. So they knew and identified their weakness. But then also, if it's just the coaching and they just dial it down a little bit, I'm not sure if they had the awareness that this was hamstringing them so much, but it definitely is a factor. And I'm hoping that they adjust that and tweak that, because I'm a firm believer in, I don't care how good you are, even if you're an undefeated team, you can get better week to week. You have to self-scout and study these things, and you can still improve. So the Lions can't sit there, oh, we won, we made it to the NFC Championship game. Let's just run it back next year. Let's just do it all over again. Every year presents its different challenges. You have to optimize everything. You have to relook at everything. And I think that they need to do that from a self-scout and evaluation perspective on the defensive side. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs, they're a team that there's absolutely no way that this team averages 5.2 air yards per pass attempt next year, which was the lowest, I want to say, since 2009. There's no way that this team ranks below average in early down efficiency again this year. There's so many things that this offense was doing last year because of the roster and the lack of trust in the receiving core that they were doing last year that I don't think we're going to get this year. I think this team is going to take that step forward offensively. They're going to have more at their disposal. They, like the Lions, understood some of their weaknesses and addressed them in the draft. They go in the draft, they draft a wide receiver, Xavier Worthy. They add Marquise Brown in free agency. They do the same thing at the tight end position where they draft a tight end and they add one in free agency. They understood they need to get better in the receiving game, more explosive down the field. And I think they're going to be able to do that, which makes them just as scary. This defense, I mean, the only thing that is going to derail the Chiefs, in my opinion, is injuries, because injuries could derail this team, but I don't think that they're going to get beat enough throughout the season to have any problems making it back to the postseason as with a comfortable margin of making it to the postseason this year. And then, of course, it's a tournament from that point onward. Then I've got a bunch of interesting player props that I'm fascinating with, but those are from a team perspective. I think those are some looks to some teams that I think one's more of a surprise. The other two, I just think that both of these teams are going to take the next step. I took the Lions over their win total. I took an alt win total for the Detroit Lions. I just think their defense is going to be a little bit better, and it's going to help. And their offense, they're fortunate, just like Spags staying in Kansas City. You get Ben Johnson as your OC staying in Detroit. He probably should have moved on. He didn't. That's a benefit, not only from the consistency aspect, but because he's one of the better, more creative and ingenious play callers in the NFL.
Well, that's great there. Well, of course, we deal in injuries, and the only thing I would modify about everything that you said is Kansas City Chiefs don't need to have injuries to be in trouble. One injury to the wrong guy, 15 will have them in trouble, but that's a whole different story, etc. But he's been pretty resistant with his patella dislocation, his high ankle that he played through the Super Bowl against the Eagles, etc. He's done it and done it well. I like your Seattle thing, but for us, based on injuries alone, we almost target. I get it. There's not a lot of people riding their bandwagon, but based on injury analysis within division, every year there's a team that goes from worst to first, right? And the Cardinals have very long odds to do so. But from a health perspective, they might be the team, just to put that into your brain there in terms of, and that's just from a health perspective. Look, we like the Texans this year. Again, you talk about liking the Chiefs, liking the Lions, because the Texans didn't play with their same offensive line for a single game last year, yet excelled, and they're slated to be healthy there. So there's a few of those in our preseason injury preview. Warren, really appreciate you. Appreciate the special promo code Doc, and go to Warren's site and get that. I appreciate that. Any final thing that you want to say? And then let's set a date for you, me, and Evan again. Let's do it. Let's have some fun.
Yeah, that would be amazing. We'll try to get the band back together. But no, don't disagree with your Houston Texans take. I think Bobby Slowick needs to just modify his strategy and optimize the way that he's calling plays there. And if he does, that's going to be a very difficult team to beat, because I can't wait to see D'Amico working with that defense for another season down there. And they obviously added pieces along the offensive side of the football. And like you said, that line is going to get a lot healthier. It can't get any worse, compared to what it was last season. That was atrocious. But they fought through it and still made it to the playoffs. So I'm excited to see CJ Stroud in year 2 for sure. So thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Before you go, I forgot this one. Since you place so much emphasis on coaching and everything, and I really respect that, my emphasis on injuries. I personally, I know him pretty well. He played quarterback for the Chargers a little bit. I call him a friend. I love Jim Harbaugh. So I'm jaded personally. I think he's awesome. He's nutty. He's crazy. He's out there, eccentric, but I love his personality. I love him as a person. What do you think about the LA Chargers with Jim Harbaugh?
Yeah, I'm excited to see it, because he's a program builder everywhere he's gone. And, he's more unique. He's not like the way that I would view a Kyle Shanahan. He's not necessarily the way I would view like an Andy Reid. Whereas those guys are like the super geniuses who I entrust with the offense, and as a result, then I can buy into everything that they're doing. With Harbaugh, you don't see that, because he's more assembling the staff and building a culture and operating a program that, like, you look at him and you're like, I don't know that I trust him, because he's not calling plays like I would trust like a Kyle or a Andy. But the reality is, his success is undeniable, and it's been repeated. And so I think that the Chargers are in good hands. I know that Greg Roman has had his struggles with taking the Ravens to that next level, right? They've had success under him with his system, but they haven't gotten to the next level. They got rid of Greg Roman, and they still haven't gotten to the next level. Granted, it's only been one season, and they won 13 games last year. So I'm certainly, from the Ravens' perspective, happy that they moved on from Greg Roman, because I like their new OC, and I like the direction that offense is headed a little bit more. But for building up the Chargers, I think Greg Roman could be an asset for them. And certainly we've seen those two guys work together well. So I'm excited to see it. Usually they have quick rebounds and turnarounds. So this is a team that could start off and surprise some people, but I think that it's going to be hard for them to have a lot of success this year, just because I do respect that the Denver Broncos are going to be a little bit better. I do think so highly of the Kansas City Chiefs that in division, it's still going to be hard to come out of this division and make the playoffs in year one. But I'll put it this way. I'm not betting against the Chargers. They just lost so much. I think they've got a little bit of a rebuild, in store for them, especially at that wide receiver position. And I think that's going to be the thing that impacts their ceiling the most this year is just when they do need to pass to come back in games, how are they going to accomplish that? I love Justin Herbert. I think he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Even though he hasn't had a solid track record, I think his talent is immense, but they just don't have that ability from a receiving perspective, as well as from the way that this offense is being designed under Roman to quickly turn around and come back in games, which is what you saw from Lamar and the Baltimore Ravens frequently under Greg Roman when they fell behind in games. How are they coming back? And with Justin Herbert's injury to his foot, which you know far more information about than I do, I don't think they're going to have him running around, nor is he normally going to be running around, even if healthy, the way that Lamar Jackson was to create things, especially when they're down in games. And as a result, like this offense just isn't going to have that pure drop back downfield passing aspect to reduce deficits late in games. And that's going to be the Achilles heel ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with you on Jim Harbaugh. I love his leadership. But I view him as someone who makes a great CEO or president of a company, but maybe he needs a good, and this is not a bad thing, a good VP of manufacturing or VP of sales, the OC around him, because he provides a lot of great leadership. And I like what you're saying. He's a program builder. So it might not be in year one, but they'll head in the right direction and figure it out. Justin Herbert will play. He will be fine. How well and how mobile is the question. There's no way he's sitting out with the plantar fascia, but how much does this time off affect his gelling with the very young wide receiver core, which you have talked about? All right, Warren, let's do this again sometime. Tell people where they can find you, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. You could just go to sharp.football, and that's the kind of gateway to the website, but also leads you to the book. And if you enter the code DOC, you'll get it for only $5. Guarantee you're not going to get as wealth of information for $5. And if you don't like it and you think you overpaid for it, find me on Twitter. I'm easy to find. Send me a DM. I'll give you a refund. Just get it if you want to. And thanks for having me, Doc. Great luck this season, and let's try to get together soon.
Let's do it. Let's do that three-way podcast. Congratulations on your success, and thanks for taking the time. That'll do it for this section of the Pro Football Doc Sports Injury Central podcast. Thank you, Warren.